Hey, howdy. Hey, my brewing brothers and sisters. I'm Jamel Zainashev.
And I'm Mike Persine, and you're listening to Brew Strong.
Nice job there. All right. Today we have a great guest in Adam Mills, and he is brewer brewer at
Sonder Brewing.
Sonder Brewing. Yes, I had that information. I wrote it down, and then I neglected to have it in my collection of stuff in front of me for the show. But that's why, you can tell I'm a professional. I've been doing this for a long time. And Adam, you're doing shows as well. You have a YouTube channel that you've got what 400 videos on there. Quite a lot of content.
Yeah. I'm making I have a channel called Adam Makes Beer over on YouTube. Same thing over on Instagram, but really all my content goes up there, and it's anywhere from informational brew house content, anything from how I break down clean fermenters, how I transfer beers, how I dry hop, full brew days, grain to glass stuff, and then including brewer interviews that I do and some live stream Q&A stuff. So yeah.
Nice. Well, and I see you're also sponsored by Blickman Engineering. John
Absolutely.
Blickman, wonderful guy, just salt of the earth, and really, he believes in taking care of Michael's also got some Blickman gear. He believes in giving back to the community, that he works with. So whether that is the home brewer who's just starting out and wants some quality gear, or the more advanced home brewer who's ready to get up to one of his Blickman towers, or somebody who's going to the pro level and using one of his tall boy fermenters that'll fit through a 36-inch door and nest nice and tight up against the wall. He's got the whole range covered, and he loves to support him by sponsoring shows. And that is money, that is cash that could go to his bottom line. He's using it to provide you guys with useful content to make you better brewers. So don't take that lightly. If you have a chance, please send him a email, feedback@blickmanengineering.com, and tell John Blickman how much you appreciate that he's sponsoring shows like ours and Adam's to help you with great content that will improve your brewing. So I think that's just a great thing that he does, and he's done it for us for 15, 16 years, which is a lot of
Yeah, man.
a lot of cheddar to apply to stupid ramblings of me and other folks. So other folks aren't so stupid. Me, I'm stupid. And today we're going to talk about thiolized yeasts. So Adam, tell me, what is a thiolized yeast?
Yeah. And so, really it's I think originally it's kind of this outcropping of, how much fruit expression can we get into our beers, especially when we think about IPA, but then on into other styles, there's use case for this stuff as well. Essentially what thiolized yeast does is it has and a couple of different companies do it different ways, but essentially they're modified yeasts that have the capacity to free bound thiols. And what that means is thiols are essentially sulfur compounds that are perceivable at a very low level. It does not take a lot of them in order to express in the beer. And they can come from malt, they can come from hops, they can come from other adjuncts. And what these yeasts do is they free them, unlock them, and then make them expressive in the finished beer.
Now, by unlock, Michael, you're a chemist. Tell me what he means by unlocking the thiols. What's happening there?
Yeah. So in their current state, as they're, before they're acted on by the enzyme, they're bound to larger molecules, either like S-cysteine or it's a glutathione or something like that. And so that they're not able to be tasted. And by using these enzymes that are expressed through the yeast, they actually attack that sulfur carbonyl bond and separate right there at that bond. And then now you've basically have your cysteine go this way and your thiol compound go this way. And now that thiol compound can be
It's able to interact with the taste receptors
Mhm.
or the aroma receptors
Right.
in our heads. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, and like like you guys are saying, it's a really low taste threshold. We're talking nanograms per liter, which is very, very, very tiny.
Right. But
Parts- yeah.
everybody wants more. I mean, the thing I keep telling people in brewing is the customer wants the fruitiest possible IPA you can produce. And the only reason that they're really a lot of times looking at IPA is because, you know, there's a lot of, you know, you know, grapefruit and, you know, mango and things like that. And it's, you know, really delicious, of course, but, you know, the customer wants as much as possible. So, Adam, you're telling me this is a yeast that will get me more of that. What kind of flavors are we really talking about?
You know, it can be a range, and what I find most commonly is explicitly passion fruit, but they'll also say guava, other tropical type notes, things like that. But yeah, with the way I've been treating it, it leans very heavily in the passion fruit direction.
Nice. Passion fruit's a great flavor to have in.
Sure.
Yeah, if I could throw a couple more in there, there's also, you know, grapefruit, gooseberry, guava, and then even there's certain thiols that express themselves in like a black currant, or even come across caddy has been really, you know, so there's all kinds of them in there. But the ones we want are the passion fruit ones.
Well, and mainly we've been using hops to get this, especially, you know, a lot of the Southern Hemisphere hops we're using at, you know, $25 a pound, you know, crazy prices like that. Or using actual passion fruit or, you know, black currants or whatever, in order to get that. The interesting thing for me, you mentioned, Adam, was that thiols actually are in malt as well.
Yeah, and this seems to be, well, first of all, this whole thing is emerging. All right, like what we're understanding about this is emerging stuff, and if you've not checked out any content that Dr. Laura Burns from Omega has done on this, I know she's on several podcasts discussing this. There's different articles online. Of course, you can go to the websites as well to dig in on this stuff. But oh, rats! Oh, could you rephrase that? I lost my train there for a second.
The fact that malts contain,
Yes,
you know, more
yes,
bound thiols than
yes.
hops or just about anything else.
Sure, and Dr. Burns will suggest that you try a lot of different base malts, and for some reason she also talks about trying local varietals as well. And it's kind of a nod to the fact that they don't seem to give too much information as to why, other than the fact that there may be just more bound precursor in various varietals, how they're handled, things like that. But yeah, I do think that's one of the interesting tweaks with this. And ultimately, it comes into something that we'll probably talk about later as a way that you can help to dial this up and down, the intensity of this thiol expression. You can do that with your base malt and blending in some adjuncts, some different things like that. So yeah, the malt aspect of it is interesting.
Well, because there's a lot, you know, I think malt in a way, it gets, you know, kind of, well, no, I don't think it gets really, yeast always got kind of pushed to the background.
Sure.
You know, people focused on malt and water and they didn't really care too much about yeast. But I think now more focus is available on yeast and more focus is on water. And I think malt's kind of sliding into the background. Oh, and hops were always at the top. But you know, malt, where it's grown, you know, determines what kind of minerals are in the malt. that are useful for fermentation, but also, a lot of other compounds and how they're grown, how much sun it got, the wind, the rain, the air around it all affects what is in that malt. And so where it was grown and, how it was malted will really make a big difference in, a lot of the compounds that are in the mash or in the wort, later on. Now, my understanding, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but my understanding is that you want to use the palest malt for more, thiol expression. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've heard some stuff in that direction as well with it. And so, leaning more into your pills malts, different things like that. And again, even with your pills malts, make sure to be checking your spec sheets. And if you do want to chase it along that line, make sure that you're getting as low color as you can, if that's something that you're interested in trying out.
Okay, cool.
If I could throw in one other thing, there was a lot of talk that I've heard also about nitrogen. So maybe trying to find malts that are low in FAN, or you're not adding any DAP, you're trying to really.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of these lyses are.
Let's do this. Let's take a short break. And when we come back, I want to hear more about why free amino nitrogen is a problem for the thiolized yeast, or not a problem, but it's something that controls, is one of the dials for controlling the thiols you get out of a thiolized yeast. We'll be back right after this. All right, we're back. We're talking with Adam Mills about thiolized yeast. The question that Michael brought up was, or the point that Michael brought up was that you've heard that the amount of nitrogen in the wort will have an effect on the ability of the yeast to free up the thiols from the malt. Tell me about it. What have you heard?
Well, so I mean, I've actually heard a good talk from that Laura, Laura Burns.
Yep.
And she talks a lot about, like, they don't really necessarily have a lot of, there's a lot of things yet to be determined on the mechanisms, but they have noticed that when you have higher concentrations of nitrogen, you do get a pretty good inhibition of that bound thiol release mechanism or a reaction. So they recommended, and then even in the new IPA, he mentions that with adding diammonium phosphate, you end up with creating, they ended up seeing less free thiols in the finished beer because and they only surmise that there's a nitrogen concentration that's inhibiting the reaction. So,
and I would wonder, is that is it because the more free amino nitrogen you have in your wort, the yeast will just focus on taking that up, and you can get that affects fermentation considerably. If you add a bunch of extra nutrient to a all malt wort, you're going to get a hot fermentation where you produce all these high alcohols or hot alcohols. So I imagine maybe the yeast are.
Yeah, I would think it might come down to like a selectivity thing, like you said, where they might be producing this beta lyase to cleave bound thiols so they can use the cysteine, and they want that little bit of protein that contains nitrogen and stuff. So if they don't need it, then maybe they're not producing any enzymes for it, so you get less. I can see that.
Well, there you go. All right, interesting. So Adam, have you and Michael, have you experimented with thiolized yeast and different base malts or different hops? Or
Yeah, I've been playing with them for a little bit since the beginning of the year, and we ended up running them as the base strain for a packaged IPA that we were putting out on store shelves. and it's an interesting thing. I haven't tweaked too much around with the base malt stuff. I do have an industry friend of mine, Chris Schneff, up at Stormcloud Brewing in Michigan, has ran quite a bit of trials just testing out base malt. So essentially taking a blonde ale, a 20 IBU blonde ale, and different malts, fermenting them out, a 5% beer, with, I believe he was running Heliogazer at them, which is one of the more expressive, if you were to compare it to like a Star Party or Cosmic Punch from Omega. The Heliogazer is kind of those yeast on steroids when it comes to unlocking thiols. And he was saying he was saying that it's definitely worth it. I don't have a real pilot system at the place that I was brewing at the time. And that's one of the times where it'd be really nice to have that, one barrel system to where you can turn out some different things. But he was really suggesting to chase that and see what you can, because he did find definitely differences between those beers.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, have you experimented with the thiolized yeasts at all?
Yeah, so I've been pretty heavy on the Tropical yeast from White Labs. I had kind of a running hypothesis that non-GMO yeast that express these molecules naturally might produce a more well-rounded, natural tasting flavor. So I've been really going for that. I worry that some of these adjuncts and GMO products might produce almost an artificial or too the concentration gets high enough where it's almost like I know with 4-MMP, if you get too high, it can get real catty, or I can only imagine like 3-MHA, you can start getting like just over the top, kind of cloyingly tropical probably. So I've been trying to keep the balance, and then I've been trying it with different hops, definitely like the big name hops, but then also I'm really going to get into those cheaper hops that are known for bound thiol content and try to unlock some of that with my next
using those on the mash side, maybe, are you thinking, or still like late boil?
Yeah, you might have heard the same stuff from Laura as well about mash hopping, and I'm jumping in. Yeah, actually I've got this crazy idea. My mother lives down the road and she's got a big Cascade vine, so I'm thinking I'm gonna pick fresh Cascade and throw it in the mash, see what happens.
Yeah.
Try to push some it's a hazy double I'm gonna do, so I'm trying to.
That's an interesting hypothesis too, though, thinking about how that expression might come off between the GMO and non-GMO approaches with that yeast.
Yeah,
Well,
and go ahead.
Well, I haven't done a lot of thiolized yeast fermentation, but what I've done with the GMO versions, it's different. I'll say, it's I won't say it's unnatural, but I have not tasted, when I taste those beers, I'm just like, what hop combination made this? And I can't imagine what it is. It seems a little odd in that way. So it's interesting, Michael, that you were saying that. And I tried to get out of Chris White the actual blend of yeasts that are in that Tropical, but yeah, I think
nothing.
Well, Travis was asking if it's got Belgian yeast in it, and I don't think it does. I think he was saying no, but then he was just like, oh, I got to look it up. And then we got talking about something else, so he didn't look it up. But my question, I was only going to reveal if it had Belgian yeast in it or not. That's
okay.
All.
Yeah.
I gotta keep secrets. Chris White, if
don't want to be.
I mean, there's all sorts of secrets, that I got to keep. Yeah, just imagine what these guys are doing.
Well, and to what you're saying, Jamil, do you find that passion fruit note? Sometimes I find it very like very flat, like it's I don't know, like it's because when you're saying that it's weird, maybe there's a lack of layer to that thiol expression. Sometime is that kind of what you're saying?
Maybe, but I think it's also acid related, because if you add
Sure.
passion fruit to a beer, once that the sugars, the fructose that's
Yeah.
in there ferments out, you get it's a bit of a tart fruit, the passion fruit. It's got quite a
Absolutely.
bit of acid. And I think that may be missing in some of that. So maybe, you need to adjust the pH on a beer you might be doing or something like
Mhm.
that to get a more natural expression, or maybe it's missing the top note. I don't know. I do know that I think, or I do, I do believe that the actual fruit, if you're trying to get passion fruit notes, the best way of getting them is to
Sure.
add passion fruit.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
Well, what do you know?
right. So, when you're adding hops to get passion fruit, there are hops with quite a bit of passion fruit character to them,
Mhm.
but they're not passion fruit either.
Sure.
But they
Sure.
have a taste and an aroma that we are familiar with now after years of brewing, trying to get passion fruit in beers using hops. And the thiolized yeast, that what it's producing is I don't think any of the producers of these yeasts are saying, oh, this is passion fruit. They're saying it's
Sure.
passion fruit like notes.
Sure.
They're just trying to describe it.
Sure.
And so it has a different character. It's got other layers in it that are not the same as adding passion fruit or using these passion fruit hops.
Mhm.
So I think that's what we're experiencing, and we just need to decide, how much we like it or not,
Sure.
you know,
Sure.
what levels to use it. So it's quite an interesting area of exploration. Have either of you done anything to try and regulate the level of these thiol precursors and the amount of thiols in there in the finished beer?
Yeah, there's a few ways you can do it, and we kind of hinted at one earlier, and it's interesting because I know some people are using these stylized strains in hazy type builds for hazy beers, and there's some things about the kind of standard build for hazy IPA, and maybe I'm talking a bit too broadly, but a lot of hazy IPAs are going to have anywhere from 15 to 25% or more of a flaked product, a white wheat, something like that, or a malted wheat. And when you're introducing those adjuncts into those beers, they don't have precursor in the same way that base malt does.
Mhm.
So kind of that somewhat traditional, we'll say traditional for something that's pretty recent, but some of those that classic type hazy grist bill,
Mhm.
if you are going that direction, it is going to be dialing down at least the malt contribution of thiol precursor. That's one way, for
So
sure.
the thiol precursors are mainly in the husk of the grain. Is that where
N-
they're coming
th-
from?
that's a really good question. I don't know if it's related to husk, but that makes a lot of sense. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
As far as I know, it has to do with the proteins in the malt, and I don't know if that's in like the acro spot. I mean, I could get on the anatomy of a malt grain, but I'm as far as I understand, it's a part of those large chain proteins that these styles get somehow bound into.
Well, a lot of these wheats have higher protein levels than your regular base grains. What they're missing is husk.
Sure.
Yeah, true that.
So I know, a lot of the tannins in malt is coming from the husk, and
Mhm.
that's where why you get a bit of methanol in your
Sure.
fermentations is because of the husk of the barley malt.
Mhm.
It's essentially like wood, and
Sure.
so you get some flavors from that. I think that's one of the things. It's very interesting that you brought that up, Adam, about wheat, kind of diluting down some of the things. I think people don't give enough thought to what the husk of the barley gives
Sure.
to to the beer and flavor. There is some flavor contribution to that. Most people look
Sure.
at it as just essentially, filtration bed.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's fascinating as well. I think there's a whole slew of things to explore that way.
Sure.
What other ways of adjusting? You mentioned mash hopping. Certain types of hops have more precursors than others. What hops
I
are
mean,
those?
that's what it seems. I mean, just kind of off the top, some hops that you wouldn't necessarily think are going to be bringing some of these tropical flavors. Things like Saaz, Hallertau, Cascade tends
Middle
to be that.
fruit.
Bittlefruit, yep. There's some in that range. I think maybe Calypso is on that list too.
It
But
is.
that's one where they seem like you can get those into the mash, and then rely on carrying that, having that carry over into your finished beer. It was one of the ideas, like, because I was considering running Heliogazer as this base strain for this production IPA that I was going to do. And so I had thought about, well, maybe if I could do like a small blonde or wheat beer as a yeast grower for this. So it would be easier if you're going to be doing a later fermentation hop, something like that. So it would be a way of keeping the beer around. So utilizing that mash hop beer just as kind of an easy session beer for the tap room, but then really using it as a yeast grower to have consistently fresh pitches of yeast for something that you would be doing maybe on the hazy side.
Mm-hmm. Now, what yeasts are available for the home brewer? Or are they all available for home brewers and pro brewers? Are there any that are pro brewer only?
That's a good question. I know the Omega stuff seems to be available to everybody. Is the Berkeley stuff as well?
I don't think so.
I don't think
no.
they sell. No.
Okay. And I think BSI might have some as well, but I don't know if they're available to folks on the homebrew side. I didn't realize that White Labs was doing or had a thiol blend that they were making as well. That's interesting, and that's not on the genetically modified side.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I know there's also kind of the difference between like Omega only uses cisgenic modifications where they're only trying to get that expression like from a yeast to another yeast, versus I don't know if that Heliogazer stuff
they're using
transgenic modifications. So
using CRISPR to take genes from
IRC7 or something with that. I think that's what they're messing with.
Another yeast. Berkeley, I know, has been using genes from actual fruit. Like, if they want blackberry character, they go to a blackberry plant and they take the genes from the plants and use that. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Don't sue me over it if I'm wrong, but I think that's the case in their modification. And then like Michael's saying, White Labs has their Tropicale, which is not genetically modified, because genetically modified yeast is an issue for, especially like our friends in England. They're not allowed to use that. I mean, home brewers could, but commercial brewers can't. So because people have their concerns, it doesn't bother me at all, but I understand if people are reticent to ingest something that was genetically modified, but doesn't bother me.
Yeah, like I said,
all the things I'll consume,
Yeah, all my considerations are flavor based. So yeah, I'm looking for the best flavor. I don't care if it's GMO or not.
Yeah, if a turd tasted good, you'd be hammering turds.
GMO or not. GMO turds.
Well, on that note, why don't we take another short break? This is the kind of content that Blickman is happy to sponsor. We'll be back right after this. All right, we're back. We're having a good time talking about thiolized yeast. So yeast that will essentially break off these tasty little pieces of proteins or whatever it is in malt and in hops and produce more fruit forward beer for you. And we're talking about how Omega has some, BSI I guess has some, White Labs has their thiolized blend. So tell me more. What's the what's the best beer style for this this technology or this product or
Sure.
this technique?
Sure. And I think with a lot of times, sometimes, we have various products hit the market. And I think ever since, I mean, probably originally, Simcoe was one of the ones that made that splash once Vinny popularized that hop. And then there's Citra, Mosaic. And and people have really been looking for that next big thing. And, I think Phantasm hit, which leads into this. And that's something that we can talk about in a little bit. But everybody is always looking to make the most aggressive version of these as you can. And I understand wanting to do that from understanding the ceiling of what these things do. But I think ultimately it's more about understanding, maybe how to fold this in an enjoyable way, right? Like, can we drive nuance? Right, rather than maybe blowing the top off. That might be the best use for some of this stuff. And so I think your gut can tell you, hey, yeah, let's take it to IPA. And there's definitely things that you can do with this strain, with those adjuncts, to fold some nuance or even step into the forefront with those beers. But I think there's a lot of other beers that, you can create interesting things with. I think it would be interesting to play with these yeasts and actually making fruit beers. So beers where you are both using real fruit and some of this thiolized capacity, right? So if you're looking to make something, tropical, you can run with passion fruit, or maybe you can get a blend of different things. Because we were saying guava, passion fruit, grapefruit. If you're looking for a little bit of a medley with something like that, I think that works great. If you want to go non-traditional, and maybe some of our style guys would be really uncomfortable with it, but I think it might be interesting to try to fold into low levels of maybe some yeast forward beers that don't typically feature that flavor profile. For instance, a Belgian Golden Strong can kind of have a white fruit component to it, whether that be pear, flesh of apple, things like that. Maybe pushing a little bit of thiol character into that may be interesting. And that's one of the things you can do too. I have friends that actually work with blends of this yeast. So they'll use a base yeast. They work with Omega and they get certain percentages, added. And that's one of the ways that they're dialing up and down that intensity, right? But I do think it's important to kind of maybe step out of the IPA, the hop forward type look at something like this, and then see what are the other interesting beer styles that we can create some nuance with a product like that.
And Michael, what have you been mainly producing hazy IPA using thiolized yeast or anything else?
For me, I've only been using it for my hazy so far, but I actually in kind of my prep for the show today, I really heard some really interesting ideas about using these for the New Zealand Pilsner, and like kind of pushing a little more fruit character, but so you do a little mash hopping, or I've heard of like blonde ales where they're doing a little bit of the stylized yeast, and like you said, kind of dialing it in, not going to the ceiling, and really trying to develop nuance and balance. But kind of like some of these beers, like you said, the style people might get a little bit sweaty on the brow, but you can do pretty much anything you want to add a little bit of that kind of fruity flavor, or even if you're kind of going more for that black currant, it's all in your hop selection and then your process to try to push either one. And you can, with these stylized yeast, push it a little further and make it present in beers that you wouldn't expect, which I think is really cool. And I'm already got the gears turning on like a New Zealand Pils or some sort of Thioli blonde.
Sure.
You
Well,
know?
and you can really look at it in the same way, like, before we did all this stuff with yeast like this, it's like, there'd be times where, we could decide, okay, do we want a neutral American ale strain, or do we want something a little bit more expressive on the British side, right? And you could almost dial it into a thought process like that. Like, it's not going to be in the forefront of the beer, but what if you leverage these yeasts to almost play like the ester type role in a beer, right? Like
definitely.
something that's more subtle, something dialed down, but something that's still there, right? And just creating layers.
Definitely.
Interesting. So let's say somebody's just starting out with thiolized yeast. You guys, what would your average home brewer wants to get into thiolized yeast? What strain should they first start with, and what kind of recipe should they put together?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of depends on what you're looking to do. If you're looking to, actually like, hey, let's find out what this is and let's look for the ceiling on this, right? Let's try to blow the top off with that. Look at something hop forward. You can put it into that style. I would recommend, if you are trying to push the upper limits on this, and this is a way you can dial that expression up and down. One of the ways that you can push back thiol expression is by getting too much green matter into the beer. This is one of the reasons why you see the suggestion of maybe using mash hopping, things like that. But from what it looks like is, the more green matter is in contact with these beers, the more it tends to, whether it's going to be some sloppy science terminology here, but whether it pulls them out or suppresses them. But that is one of the things. So leaning on an advanced hop product, a cryo might be a way to try to maximize those things, because you're removing green matter from the equation. So if you are looking at, trying to blow the top off in that way, chase something like that. But if you're looking for maybe just straight line, almost making a beer for purely for a scientific sake to figure out what's actually happening, maybe it is better to pull it back to a blonde type beer, right? And try out the mash hopping, and even pair in some of those hop products later. You know what I mean? That may have less green matter in play. So there's a few different ways that you could take it. What are your thoughts?
I guess for me, I always recommend, when people are trying this out, use it in a recipe you've made several times and try to get a sensory of like, okay, I like this beer. I've always liked this beer. I've made it for years. Like my friend Kevin, he makes this killer hazy, and he's always used Boddingtons or juice, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I had him try the Tropicale, and these beers couldn't be, they were very different. And so it was really cool to see that, and kind of trying that out, I thought was a really cool way to experiment with these yeasts, is to go with something you've already done and really see how it changes.
Have you seen that you need to pull back dry hop levels on those beers? Have you played with that at all? So you said kind of taking a standard hazy recipe, one that and typically those are going to be pretty aggressively dry hopped. I've found it interesting that by pulling back the dry hop in the IPA that I was making for store shelf, that was when the passion fruit character really started to step forward. I was almost over dry hopping for, if the goal is thiol expression. Have you found that at all? Have you played with that at all?
I have not yet, but that's definitely a good point about the green matter. I've seen that in several articles about there's some sort of mechanism pulling that out. But I will say though, for us and on our experiences where we'd make a hazy with Boddingtons and then go to the thiol, you kind of just, they're almost just as fruity, but they're a lot less the grapefruit. They're a lot less citrus, and they do become more of that guava passion fruit kind of, they almost have kind of a more tropical, almost a sweeter body to them than kind of that tart grapefruit or kind of orange or something, so
Sure.
it's really interesting to see this change. But I definitely, as I get more into these and I use it more often, I kind of dabble back and forth between my crazy experiments and then trying to make a classic style. Like I just
Sure.
made a Märzen and I tried to do it like Reinheitsgebot pretty much and see if I can't hit that. So I go back and forth, but yeah, I definitely want to try that. So
Sure.
Are there other tips or tricks for people that are, starting out with this kind of yeast?
I would also, something that we haven't talked too much about just yet is we haven't talked really about some of the, non-traditional adjuncts as far as something like Phantasm goes. Essentially grape skins. And are these are derived from New Zealand, if I'm correct? Is that the base source for Phantasm?
yes, I believe it's a product, because again, those wines that were made down there became
Yeah.
super synonymous with their tropical characteristics. So then it was
Sure.
almost like they decided to take that next step.
Sure. Yeah, and so you can fold that in. I know Berkeley, if I'm not sure if it's available on the home side, but I know on the pro side they have like a thiol boost liquid that you can add, that which is essentially liquid Phantasm, but it has measured amounts of precursor in it, so that's some stuff that you can play with. But big picture, almost every element that you can think of will play into how these thiols are going to be expressing. Everything from fermentation temperature. From what I understand, if you're looking to push up on the high side, maybe fermenting a little bit on the cooler side may help you retain some of those thiols. Maybe if you're ramping that temp up to the higher end of the spectrum, you might be, essentially blowing off some of those notes. So yeah, it's one of those things where if you are looking for fruit forward beers, it is one of those where you just got to give it a shot and maybe go with what Michael was talking about. Take that IPA recipe that you like, and then fold that yeast in and see what it does for it, because it is an interesting thing.
All right. Paul had sent in via email, and I'll tell you, if you guys have questions for Brew Strong, you can send them in to brewstrong@thebrewingnetwork.com. And we're getting to all the new ones that come in. We're getting to them really quick. And we're still mixing in, a lot of the ones from a decade ago. So don't worry, we'll get to every question, but we are getting to the new ones quicker is one of my focuses now. But Paul had written in not long ago. Literally the title of his email was 2023 IPA advice. But one of the questions he had was, thiol yeasts and Phantasm versus Kvike or traditional yeasts. What do you guys have, response to that? Phantasm versus Kvike, or, traditional yeasts or thiolized yeasts?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we kind of touched on, before when we were talking about, what people think are going to be the next big thing in on the brewing side. And there is that time period with Kvike, and I think Kvike is great. There's a brewery that I worked at that was we'll say very rustic, and I turned probably about 150 batches with various strains of Kvike, and it definitely has it has its use cases and whatnot. But I would tend to lean toward, I think you can achieve potentially more interesting things maybe with the thiolized side of things, and incorporating some things like Phantasm and what we talked about before, various approaches as far as the hops, advanced hop products, cryo hops. I just feel like it's more expressive than maybe what you get out of the Kvike side of things. Again, maybe it won't be your thing going full bore with it, but I think it's more different than the Kvike approach is. But that's just my take.
Yeah, my take is I love how many options we're getting. And it's kind of,
Sure.
as a craft brewer, you have all of these tools in your tool bag now, and you can, depending on what you're going for, like I make it's a smash hazy pale ale, but I use Voss like, and then with the Lotus hops, I don't know if there's just a synergy there. I don't go crazy with the temperature. I'm around 80. So it's
Sure.
not this funky Kveiki beer. It's kind of got a nice, real good, nice orange citrus note to it. And, those are things you can play with. And then I kind of also see the future going forward is, I think, blending of yeast and looking for expressions that you can't get with single yeast fermentations. Like you said, going 30% thiol and then maybe 10% Kveik, and then mixing in some Boddingtons, or even trying some other strains, and really making your own blend, and becoming kind of that mad scientist. And
Well, that's actually what my
yeah.
buddy's been playing with. He's been playing with specifically blends of I believe Cosmic Punch and Voss,
Yeah.
the
Heck
Voss
yeah.
Kvike. You know what I mean? And using that as a way to dial that up and down too. Yeah, I think yeast blending is a great approach. So I don't think it necessarily has to be either or.
Right.
Because I think you bring up a good point. Yeah, there's a lot of room to play right there.
Yeah, yeast blends are really becoming more and more of a thing now. I mean, there was a time where, nobody wanted to blend yeast. It was all about pure culture, pure strain, one yeast, that was it. You never had anything else. And now, that's something of real interest to modern brewers is, blending yeasts. So quite fascinating. We got some questions coming in from the chat. One of the things, if you're listening live, you can, on Facebook, you click on the comment section, comment link there below the video, and it will pop up a comments page there where you can ask your questions live, and we will get to them on the air. What we're going to do right now, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we will have a couple of questions from the chat right after this. All right, we're back. We're talking thiolized yeast and having a lot of fun here. Simon from Italy, he is a professional brewer, and he wants to get into thiol beer soon. But in the EU, this kind of yeasts are forbidden. I think that's why we mentioned the White Labs Tropical yeast is something that is not forbidden because it's not genetically modified. So I would suggest, trying that yeast for sure. He said he wants to go obviously hazy, and which is the most aromatic potential style. Hazy base of malts and flakes, mash hopping with potential hops like Saaz. Then going for shorter boil, same proteins, and Phantasm for the whirlpool. His comment is thiols should just boost up tropical notes and not overdo thiols. You can get some unpleasant notes if you overdo it. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And he was naming all the big ways to really, hit the top end. You know what I mean? He's looking at getting, precursor in the mash, precursor in whirlpool with Phantasm, different things like that. So yeah, if you are looking to moderate that impression a little bit, you definitely don't want to be throwing the kitchen sink at it. You know what I mean? Because maybe you will get that note that's just too much for you with what you want to be doing.
Well, and there's some yeast out there that they do this releasing of thiols. Isn't that right, Michael? They're
Yeah, there's plenty of strains that have free thiol content. I mean, those are more your big name, big expensive per pound strains like Citra, Mosaic.
Oh, I mean yeasts.
Oh,
that,
yeast.
that actually unlock thiols from wherever they're bound.
Oh, yeah. So there are natural strains. I know on White Labs, they have a big write-up about their Tropical yeast, and they actually have their assay chart with the different strains and their relative thiolization. And you can go check it out. There's some pretty interesting ones on there that are higher, lower, less, more. You can make your own Tropical blend. I mean, I think what they do is they probably targeted it and then tried to get the right flavor for you, so you weren't using a lot of like YPL 300 and ending up with a banana bomb on
Sure,
top of
sure.
your thiol bomb.
Sure.
So yeah, there's some
Now, I
interesting ones
imagine
out there.
it's also possible that, you know, certain yeasts in a blend, since we're talking about blending yeast, actually work in concert and maybe do a better job of unlocking thiols than the individual strains by themselves. Is that a possibility?
From what I understand, the thiolization happens intracellularly, so I don't know that they would have much interaction with each other in terms of the different strains, like, and then affecting their own biochemistry. Maybe on a, so that's where biology is wild, man. You don't really know. The only thing to do would be to try it and just, I think at our level at least, to try it and see where you end up.
That's one of the beauties of being a home brewer is it's not that expensive to try, and you can have a lot of fun with it. Also in the chat, one more question. Eric, he asks, let's see. I heard that if you're using thiol yeast, you should back off on dry hopping. Is that true?
Yeah, it's really something I found. I ended up pulling a dry hop. I had a standard, you know, house hazy that I was doing for some time, and that was receiving about 4 pounds per barrel dry hop. And when I used heliogaser with it, the thiol expression was there, but it was definitely in the background. It was still very much a hop forward beer as far as the expression rather than thiol forward. And then when I made a different hazy, but still a very similar build, and I pulled back green matter on it, one, because it was just less hops overall. I pulled that beer back to about 1.5 pounds per barrel in dry hop. And that's when the thiol character really jumped in the beer. Now, part of that could also be the fact that maybe there was not the overall hop intensity competing with the thiol character as well. But I have seen that, and I've seen that suggestion be offered by Dr. Burns and some others, that maybe look at dialing that total volume down of dry hop, and that might help that thiol character to pop a bit more.
So the thought is that either the thiols are binding to the green matter, or the intensity of the hop expression is masking the thiols that have been released by the yeast. Does that sum it up? Either one of you?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what you guys are saying is it seems like there's I will also add too in that I've heard there was a really good podcast with Laura, and she was mentioning that they noticed with T90 in the Whirlpool, they had a big reduction in thiols. So there's some interesting, almost empirical evidence that, if you use some of those fancier products like Salvo or Cryo or
Incognito,
Spectrum, Incognito, and you try to minimize green matter in the Whirlpool, I mean, there's interesting data. So,
well, there you go. Anything else on the subject of thiolized yeast?
One thing I would just talk about sulfur real quick.
Oh yeah.
Sulfur is one of those things that can pop off, and I do believe, and Michael and you may both have a better idea than me, but are these thiol side compounds? I believe they are sulfur related, correct?
Well, yeah, thiol's like an alcohol, but instead of oxygen, it's a sulfur. I don't think that they're really, next to those guys, the same sulfides that produce like cabbage or vegetable, or they're not going to be in that same neighborhood.
Sure. I haven't had a ton of issue with sulfur, but you will see some stuff on forums, some people posting and saying that they're getting, heavily sulfury beers out of this. Obviously, you want to be doing everything you can as far as, yeast management, yeast health, appropriate pitching rates, everything like that. But they do say that sometimes these beers will kick extra sulfur, and one of the keys with them is giving them If you do run into that, a healthy conditioning period, they'll say, you know, you don't have to necessarily think about conditioning as far as like a full-on lagering like you would for a traditional German Pils or something like that, but making sure that that beer has enough time to take care of that sulfur is something that might be a bit of something to look out for on the back end of these fermentations.
Well, there you go. Very interesting subject. I appreciate you guys participating and revealing key things about thiolized yeast. Thank you to our sponsor, Blickman Engineering, for paying for the show so you don't have to. If you enjoy the show, make sure you send him a nice email at feedback@Blickman Engineering. His name's John Blickman, the owner of the company. He's been supporting, home brewers and pro brewers for a long time. So just tell him thank you. That's the least you can do if you enjoyed this hour of programming. Until then, everybody, brew strong.
Brew strong.